discovery of a body is now being investigated as a murder. Honolulu police were called to the 2600 block of Dole Street yesterday afternoon. Officials say a decomposed body was found in a storm drain. The case was classified as an unattended death, but today police say an autopsy revealed the female victim suffered multiple gunshot wounds. Police have opened a second-degree murder investigation. No arrests have been made.
Manoa, Hawaii, is the kind of place where life feels both ordinary and extraordinary. Nestled in the valley just outside Honolulu, it is a neighborhood defined by green hills, flowering trees, and a sense of quiet stability. Families build their lives there with a kind of trust in the community, children walk to school, and people wave to one another from porches and driveways. It is a place where tragedy feels far away, the sort of neighborhood where the chaos of the world seems to pause at the edge of the valley. Yet in March 2024, Manoa became the setting for one of the most horrifying family tragedies in Hawaii's modern history. A story so brutal and shocking that it would reverberate far beyond the valley itself. The center of the story was the Oda family. Paris and Naoko Oda were raising their 3 children in Manoa, and by all outward appearances, theirs was a stable life. Paris was 46 years old, his wife Naoko 48. And together they had built a family anchored by love for their children. 17-year-old Sakurako, 12-year-old Orion, and 10-year-old Nana. Each child was at a different stage of life, carrying different dreams and personalities. But they were bound together by the warmth of their household. Friends and neighbors described the Odas as a family who seemed to blend in, not loud or attention-seeking, simply living their lives in the quiet rhythms of Manoa. Naoko was remembered as devoted and nurturing. She was a mother first, someone whose days revolved around her children's schooling, their activities, their well-being. Friends admired her kindness, her willingness to help, the way she seemed to give everything she had to her family. Paris, meanwhile, carried the outward role of a provider. He was educated, ran his own chiropractic practice, and was seen as ambitious and hardworking. The couple had been together long enough to have weathered the usual storms of marriage, and for those on the outside, there was little reason to believe they were in deep trouble, but beneath the surface, pressure was building. Paris had been struggling with financial problems that grew harder to conceal. Tax debts mounted, business challenges worsened, and the weight of those troubles pressed down on him relentlessly. To his family, he did not always reveal the full extent of his despair, but in private conversations he had begun to express things that alarmed those closest to him. By February 2024, just weeks before the tragedy, he was telling relatives that he would rather die than go to jail, that he could not face the collapse of his world. The words seemed dramatic, almost unthinkable, but they carried the rawness of a man who saw no way out. His children, meanwhile, carried on in innocence. Sakurako was 17, nearing adulthood, with all the dreams of someone about to step into independence. She was bright, thoughtful, beginning to imagine what life beyond high school might look like. Orion, 12, was at the heart of middle school life, curious and adventurous, the kind of boy who still carried the wide-eyed wonder of childhood but was testing the edges of adolescence. Nana, just 10, was still in elementary school, her world defined by imagination, friends, and the safety of home. To all of them, their father's struggles were largely invisible. They were focused on the things children should be: school projects, friendships, their mother's affection. They could not have imagined that the man they trusted most would one day turn on them. The Oda's home in Manoa was typical of the neighborhood, comfortable, not extravagant, but a place built for family life. Neighbors saw the children playing, saw Naoko gardening, saw Paris coming and going. There was no history of domestic violence, no police calls that would have marked the house as dangerous. It was, to all outward appearances, just another home in a quiet valley. And that is what makes what happened in March so haunting. The brutality erupted not after years of documented conflict, but seemingly without warning. In the days before March 10th, the pressure on Paris had intensified. He had attempted to obtain a firearm, perhaps as a means of ending his life, perhaps with darker intentions, but he was unsuccessful. The failure left him cornered, still burdened, still unable to see a way out. What exactly snapped in him remains a matter of speculation. But on that night, Between 2 o'clock and 2:30 in the morning, Paris Oda picked up a kitchen knife and unleashed a violence so complete that it annihilated the family he had once built. Neighbors would later describe hearing sounds in the early hours. Muffled arguments, a disturbance they could not quite place. By morning, a tenant living on the property noticed blood seeping through a door and called 911. When police arrived at 8:30 a.m., they had no legal grounds to force entry, but the second call less than an hour later left them no choice. What they found inside was a scene of unimaginable horror. Naoko lay dead, her children alongside her, each stabbed repeatedly, each bearing defensive wounds that told the story of a desperate struggle to survive. Paris himself was dead too, his life ended by his own hand after destroying the people he had once called his family. The crime scene was described as one of the most devastating officers had ever witnessed, the kind of tableau that sears itself permanently into memory. For Manoa, the news spread like wildfire. Families who had considered the Odas their neighbors, who had waved to them on walks, who had exchanged small talk at community events, were left shaken. How could such a thing happen here, in this valley known for peace? How could a father, a provider, a man without a record of violence, suddenly decide to destroy everything? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, unanswerable. For relatives of the Oda family, the loss was unbearable. Not one life, but 5, stolen in a single night. Sakurako, Orion, and Nana would never see the futures they had imagined. Naoko, a mother who had devoted her life to raising her children, was gone. Paris, the source of their destruction, had taken himself as well, leaving no chance for explanation, no opportunity for remorse, no possibility of accountability. The tragedy immediately drew comparisons to Hawaii's darkest crimes, including the Xerox murders of 1999, one of the deadliest mass shootings in the state's history. Yet this crime was different in its intimacy, its proximity, its violation of the sacred trust between a parent and child. It was not the act of a stranger. It was the annihilation of a family from within. As investigators pieced together the timeline, the motive became clearer. Financial collapse had driven Paris into despair, his fear of prison and disgrace eclipsing his love for his family. In his mind, twisted by pressure and hopelessness, killing them and himself had become an escape. Yet to the world outside, the act was unforgivable, incomprehensible. Nothing, no debt, no fear, no despair, could ever justify the destruction of innocent lives. In the aftermath, the Manoa Valley was cloaked in grief. Vigils were held, candles flickered in the night, flowers piled outside the Oda home. Strangers wept for the children they had never met. Families clung tighter to their own loved ones, shaken by the reminder that safety can be an illusion, that tragedy can strike even in the quietest neighborhoods. And for Hawaii, the murders became a story not only of one man's collapse, but of the fragility of human life itself, of how quickly the ordinary can become extraordinary, of how a single night can shatter generations. On the night of March 9, 2024, Manoa Valley lay quiet under the weight of the Hawaiian sky. The Oda household looked like any other that evening, lights glowing faintly against the mountainside. Neighbors would later recall nothing unusual. Paris Oda had gone about his day like he often did, carrying the invisible weight of debt and dread, hiding behind the mask he had worn for months. Naoko and the children had spent the day as they usually would, with no one outside the home sensing that within hours, their lives would be ripped apart. But sometime in the early hours of March 10th, between 2 o'clock and 2:30 a.m., the mask shattered. Inside the house, Paris armed himself with a kitchen knife and carried out an act of violence so shocking that even seasoned investigators struggled to process it. The details of what unfolded are pieced together from the crime scene, the autopsy reports, and the sounds that filtered through the neighborhood that night. Investigators determined that Naoko was likely attacked first. At 48, she had been the anchor of the household, the protector of her children. Defensive wounds on her body revealed how desperately she had fought, hands and arms scarred with cuts that spoke of struggle. Her final moments were spent trying to survive, to defend herself against the man she had once trusted with her life. The children, 17-year-old Sakurako, 12-year-old Orion, and 10-year-old Nana, bore the same marks of desperation. Each of them fought back, their small bodies leaving behind evidence of resistance. The defensive wounds on their hands told the story of children who had not gone quietly, who had tried to fend off the father they should never have feared. Their last minutes were filled with terror, betrayal, and an instinctive fight for life that be why the time Paris turned the knife on himself. The home was soaked in silence, interrupted only by the hum of the night outside. What drove him in those minutes is something the world will never fully know. Was it rage, despair, or a distorted idea of sparing his family from shame? What is known is that the act was deliberate, forceful, and final in the early morning. As the sun rose over Manoa, signs of horror began to seep out of the Oda home. A tenant who lived on the property noticed something unusual, the sound of an argument earlier, and now, blood seeping through a door. Alarmed, they called 911, reporting what they had seen. At around 8:30 a.m., police arrived at the residence. The responding officers faced a dilemma. From the outside, there was no immediate sign of distress. The tenant's report was troubling, but legally, the police had no grounds to force their way inside. They knocked, they waited, but when no one answered, they left. Noting the incident, but unable to act further, IT was not until a second call came in. Shortly after 9 a.m., that urgency escalated. Another witness described the disturbing scene, the growing certainty that something was very wrong inside. This time, officers returned determined to gain entry. What they found when they crossed the threshold would stay with them forever. The Oda family lay dead. The bodies of Naoko and her 3 children were discovered in separate rooms, each marked by the violence of the night before. Paris's body was found as well, the knife nearby, his final act complete. The scene was one of devastation. A family annihilated in the place they should have been safest. Even for officers who had seen death before, the sight was unbearable. These were not strangers, but a family known in the community. The children were school-aged, their lives ahead of them. The brutality of the knife wounds, the evidence of their struggle, the sheer scale of the loss pressed heavily on everyone present. Word spread quickly. Neighbors gathered outside, watching as police cars and ambulances filled the narrow street. They whispered in disbelief, some crying openly, others unable to speak. This was Manoa, a place of peace, of families, of safety. The idea that 5 lives had been extinguished in one night, within one home, by the hand of a father, was almost too much to comprehend. As the day went on, more details emerged. Autopsies confirmed what investigators suspected. The victims had died from multiple stab wounds, and all bore defensive injuries. The children's small hands, their mother's arms, each told a silent story of resistance, of a desperate attempt to escape. The community learned that Paris had turned the knife on himself last, his own wounds self-inflicted. It was a murder-suicide, a familicide that stood among the worst in Hawaii's recent history. Reporters descended on the neighborhood. Cameras captured the solemn scene as investigators carried bodies from the home. Headlines flashed across Hawaii and the mainland. Family of 5 found dead in Honolulu. Manoa murders shock Hawaii. The story gripped the state not only because of its brutality, but because of its setting. Manoa was not a place associated with violence. To many, it was unthinkable that such horror could unfold there. For the families of Naoko and Paris, the grief was compounded by confusion. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, Paris had shown signs of unraveling. His financial troubles were no secret to those closest to him. Tax debts loomed, business struggles mounted, and he had confided to relatives that he would rather die than face prison. Some recalled him saying chilling things about ending his family's life and destroying the house, words dismissed at the time as hyperbole, but now viewed with devastating clarity. The Oda family's relatives struggled to understand how a man who had once been loving could descend into such darkness. They remembered him as intelligent, ambitious, even kind, but also as someone burdened by pride and fear of failure. To them, the murders were both incomprehensible and inevitable, the tragic culmination of warnings they had not been able to stop. For the community, the shock transformed into grief. Vigils were held outside the Oda home, candles flickering in memory of Naoko, Sakurako, Orion, and Nana. Strangers came to pay respects, leaving flowers and notes. Mourning children they had never met, but whose faces they had seen in photos. The names of the victims echoed through the valley, carried in prayers, etched in memory that it was clear from the start that this was not simply another crime story. It was a rupture in the fabric of a neighborhood, a reminder that even in the most peaceful places, despair can lurk behind closed doors. And as details of Paris's financial troubles began to emerge, questions multiplied. How had he been allowed to sink so deeply into desperation? Could anyone have intervened? Could the deaths have been prevented? The answers were elusive, and for now, the only certainty was loss. A mother, 3 children, gone in a night of terror. A father who became their killer, leaving behind a community trying to make sense of senseless violence. Manoa would never be the same. In the days following the murders, investigators and journalists began to piece together the life of Paris Oda. On paper, he was the picture of stability, 46 years old, educated, with his own chiropractic business in Honolulu. He was married to Naoko, a devoted mother and partner, and together they had 3 bright, beautiful children. Their lives, from the outside, seemed secure. But beneath the surface, cracks had been spreading for years. Cracks that widened under the pressure of debt, pride, and despair until they finally split wide open on the night of March 10th, 2024. That the first pieces of the puzzle came from Paris's finances. Records revealed unpaid taxes stretching back years. His business, once promising, had been struggling. Bills mounted, creditors pressed, and Paris's fear of losing everything deepened. Money is often at the heart of hidden stress, and for Paris it became an unbearable weight. By February 2024, just weeks before the murders, he had begun to tell relatives disturbing things. He confided to some that he would rather die than go to jail for financial crimes. He spoke of shame, of failure, of an inability to face the collapse of his reputation. Most chillingly, he told a relative that he wanted to kill his family and burn the house down. At the time, the words were taken as an expression of despair rather than a literal threat. But in hindsight, they were a blueprint for the horror to come. Investigators learned that Paris had also tried to obtain a firearm in the weeks before the murders. He had approached others about acquiring a gun, but failed. Denied that outlet, he turned instead to a kitchen knife, a weapon readily available in every home. The choice made the murders more intimate, more brutal. It forced him into direct confrontation with each member of his family, leaving behind the evidence of struggle etched into their defensive wounds. To those who had once trusted Paris, the revelations were devastating. How long had he been planning this? How had no one stopped him? Relatives replayed his words, wishing they had acted differently, wishing they had sounded an alarm. But human beings often minimize danger when it comes from those they love. Threats can sound like exaggerations until they become reality. As the investigation unfolded, the community began to confront the broader picture. Paris had not been known as violent. There had been no domestic violence calls to the house, no police records suggesting danger. In fact, neighbors described the Oda home as quiet, even happy. The children were seen playing, Naoko gardening, Paris coming and going like any father in Manoa. The absence of outward warning signs made the murders all the more incomprehensible. Experts called it a classic case of familicide, the killing of one's own family, often motivated by financial stress, shame, or control. Across the world, familicides are rare but chillingly consistent. The perpetrator, almost always male, feels cornered, unable to maintain the image of success or stability. Rather than face failure, he destroys those closest to him. It is an act of control, of distorted pride, of desperation turned homicidal. Paris Oda fit the profile with haunting accuracy. The children, Sakurako, 17, Orion, 12, Nana, 10, had no chance against him. Autopsy reports confirmed they had each suffered multiple stab wounds. Their hands bore defensive cuts, evidence that even in their terror they tried to fight back. Their innocence made the crime all the more unbearable. These were not strangers or rivals. They were his children, the very people he had sworn to protect. That Naoko's loss struck the community just as deeply. At 48, she was remembered as kind, dedicated, and nurturing. Friends described her as the type of woman who gave everything to her children, who rarely thought of herself, who embodied the role of mother in every sense. That she had died defending her children from her own husband painted a picture of ultimate betrayal. of trust shattered in the most violent way possible. As these details emerged, the community of Manoa gathered in grief. Vigils were held, candles lit, flowers piled up at the site of the home. Photos of the family, smiling, together, were displayed, a stark contrast to the reality of their final hours. Neighbors wept openly, struggling to reconcile the family they had known with the crime that had destroyed them. Local leaders spoke of the tragedy as a reminder of the hidden struggles people face. They urged others to speak out if they sensed despair in their loved ones. They emphasized that shame should never outweigh the value of life. Yet for many, the words rang hollow in the face of 5 coffins. The psychological profile of Paris Oda fascinated and horrified experts. Here was a man who had everything to live for: a wife, 3 children, a respected profession, and yet he had been willing to obliterate it all rather than face financial ruin. To some, it was a story of toxic pride, of a man unable to admit failure. To others, it was a story of untreated mental illness, of despair left to fester until it exploded. To still others, it was simply evil. The community also questioned whether the tragedy could have been prevented. Had the relatives who heard his threats reported them to authorities? Could intervention have saved lives? Had the police acted more aggressively during the first 911 call that morning? Could the murders have been interrupted? These questions lingered without clear answers, gnawing at those who felt powerless in hindsight. For the families of Naoko and the children, grief turned into a public nightmare. They had to bury loved ones while reading headlines dissecting their final moments. They had to watch strangers speculate about motive while they struggled simply to survive each day. And yet, through their pain, they received an outpouring of support. The community rallied with donations, meals, and vigils, determined that the Odas would not be forgotten. Paris's name, however, became synonymous with betrayal. He was remembered not as a father or provider, but as a murderer, a man who chose annihilation over accountability. His legacy was stained permanently by the blood of his family. His desperation immortalized in horror by the end of March. The Manoa murders were etched into Hawaii's memory alongside the Xerox shootings and other rare but devastating acts of violence. Yet the Oda's story was unique in its intimacy. It was not the story of strangers killed by a gunman. It was the story of a father who killed his wife and children in the sanctuary of their home. It was the story of how despair, unchecked and unspoken, can destroy even the most ordinary family. In the days that followed the Manoa murders, Honolulu awoke to a new reality. The lush valley, once synonymous with quiet family life, had become the site of a crime scene that would haunt Hawaii for years to come. Police tape fluttered against the gentle trade winds. Officers filed in and out of the Oda home, and the community stood outside in stunned silence. The Honolulu Police Department held press conferences, careful with their words, but clear about the devastation they had uncovered. Investigators confirmed what the community already feared. Paris Oda had killed his wife, Naoko, and their 3 children, Sakurako, 17, Orion, 12, and Nana, 10, before taking his own life. Autopsy reports confirmed multiple stab wounds on each victim, the presence of defensive injuries, and the overwhelming evidence of a night of terror inside the home. Chief investigators described it as one of the most disturbing crime scenes in the department's history. Seasoned officers admitted privately that they would carry the images with them for the rest of their lives. Forensic teams combed through the house, documenting every trace of the crime. But the narrative was already painfully clear. A father driven by despair had annihilated his family. The question of why dominated coverage. Hawaii News Now, the Honolulu Star-Advertiser, and national outlets all sought to understand how Paris Oda, a chiropractor, a father, a husband, had descended into violence. The answer, according to police and relatives, lay in financial collapse. Unpaid taxes had piled up, business failures loomed, and Paris's pride prevented him from seeking help. His words to relatives weeks earlier, that he would rather die than go to jail, now read like prophecy. Yet to those who knew Naoko and the children, motive was irrelevant. Nothing could justify the crime. Nothing could explain how a man could look at his wife and children and choose death for them all. Friends and relatives of Naoko remembered her as a loving mother who had given everything to her family. They spoke of her patience, her warmth, her devotion. They wept for Sakurako, on the cusp of adulthood, with her whole life ahead of her. They mourned Orion, 12 years old, with a curiosity and spirit that lit up classrooms. They grieved Nana, just 10, still a child, her future stolen before it could begin. The funerals drew hundreds. The service for Naoko and the children was filled with flowers, photos, and the soft hum of hymns. Community members who had never met the family attended, compelled by the enormity of the loss. Teachers spoke of the children's potential, friends remembered their laughter, relatives clutched one another in sorrow. Paris was not memorialized with them. His name was spoken with bitterness, his act an unforgivable betrayal. Comparisons quickly arose to Hawaii's other infamous tragedies. The Xerox murders of 1999, when a disgruntled employee killed 7 of his coworkers, had long stood as the state's darkest crime. The Manoa murders, though on a smaller scale, struck with equal force because of their intimacy. This was not workplace violence. This was not strangers targeted. This was a family, destroyed from within, in the supposed safety of their home. The case forced conversations about mental health, financial stress, and the stigma of failure. Experts warned that the pressure Paris felt was not unique. Across the country, families struggle with debt, shame, and unspoken despair. What made this case stand apart was how that despair metastasized into violence. Advocates called for greater support systems, better intervention methods, and more open dialogue about mental health, especially among men conditioned to hide weakness. For the community of Manoa, healing was slow. Neighbors placed flowers and candles outside the Oda home, transforming it into a shrine of grief. Children left drawings for Sakurako, Orion, and Nana. Notes written in shaky handwriting expressed sorrow, confusion, love. At night, the glow of candles flickered against the darkness. A small defiance against the violence that had extinguished so much light in classrooms across Honolulu. Teachers explained the tragedy to students who had lost classmates. Counselors were brought in, offering space for children to talk about their fears, their confusion, their grief. Parents hugged their own children tighter, reminded of how fragile life can be. The investigation itself closed quickly. With Paris dead, there would be no trial, no courtroom drama, no long legal battle. But the absence of legal proceedings left the grief unresolved. There was no chance for Naoko's family to face the man responsible, no opportunity to hear him explain or apologize, no measure of justice to cling to. Instead, there was only silence, punctuated by the question that haunted everyone. Could this have been prevented? Some pointed to the warning signs. Paris had spoken of killing his family. He had expressed his despair openly to at least one relative. He had attempted to acquire a firearm. Had these signs been taken more seriously, could intervention have saved Naoko and the children? Police defended their actions, noting that no prior domestic violence reports existed, no evidence had justified intervention. But hindsight left the community restless, wondering what more could have been done. The summer of 2024, the Oda home stood as a painful reminder. Some called for it to be torn down, unable to bear the sight of the place where so much life had been lost. Others argued it should remain, a testament to the dangers of silence, a warning carved into the valley itself. The legacy of the Manoa murders is twofold. On one level, it is the story of a family destroyed by the despair of a father who could not bear his own failures. On another, it is a story of resilience, of a community that refused to look away, that honored the victims, that demanded conversations about how to prevent such tragedies. Naoko, Sakurako, Orion, and Nana are remembered not for the way they died, but for the way they lived. Friends recall Naoko's nurturing heart, Sakurako's laughter, Orion's curiosity, Nana's innocence. Their names are spoken at vigils, written in tributes, carried in memory. Paris's name, in contrast, is spoken only in whispers, a warning of what happens when pride and despair consume a man completely. Manoa will heal, but the scar will remain. The valley that once symbolized peace now carries the memory of one of Hawaii's darkest nights. And in the story of the Oda family, there is a lesson both heartbreaking and urgent, that silence can be deadly, that despair must not be ignored, and that the bonds of family should never, under any weight, be broken by violence that I in the end. The Manoa murders are not just about one night in March 2024. They are about the fragility of life, the hidden battles behind closed doors, and the devastating consequences when help comes too late. Naoko, Sakurako, Orion, and Nana Oda, gone, but not forgotten.